What I'm about to tell you will fundamentally change how you understand the most dangerous geopolitical crisis of our lifetime. Right now, at this very moment, the world stands closer to nuclear confrontation than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the terrifying part, most people have no idea it's happening. They don't understand the mechanics. They don't see the pattern. They don't recognize that we've already crossed the point of no return. I've spent the last 40 years studying how empires collapse, how great powers collide, and how nations sleepwalk into wars that destroy everything they've built. And I'm telling you right now, with absolute certainty, that the Western alliance has just made the single most catastrophic strategic blunder in modern history. This isn't hyperbole. This isn't fear-mongering. This is cold, hard analysis of structural forces that have governed international politics for centuries. And by the time I'm done explaining this to you, you'll understand exactly why the next decade will reshape global power in ways that most experts aren't even willing to acknowledge yet. Let me start with a question that should keep every American awake at night. Why would the most powerful military alliance in human history, an alliance that won the Cold War without firing a shot, an alliance that dominated global security for 70 years, why would that alliance deliberately provoke a nuclear-armed rival in its own backyard? Why would it push relentlessly toward a confrontation that offers no strategic benefit, massive risk, and the potential for civilizational catastrophe? The answer to that question reveals everything you need to know about how empires fall. NATO was created in 1949 with one purpose: contain Soviet expansion in Europe. It wasn't about spreading democracy. It wasn't about universal values. It was a defensive alliance built on cold strategic logic. The Soviet Union was expanding. Western Europe was vulnerable. America needed a coalition to prevent Moscow from dominating the European continent. That was the deal. That was the mission. And for 40 years, it worked. The alliance held. The Soviets stayed contained. And when the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, NATO had achieved total victory. But here's where the story takes a dark turn. After the Cold War ended, after the Soviet threat disappeared, after Russia accepted its defeat and began dismantling its empire, NATO didn't dissolve. It didn't scale back. It didn't declare victory and go home. Instead, it did something that every serious strategist warned against. It expanded, it pushed east, it moved toward Russia's borders, and it violated the most fundamental principle of great power politics. When you defeat a rival, you don't humiliate them. You don't corner them. You give them a dignified exit, a sphere of influence, and a seat at the table. Because if you don't, if you push too far, if you back them into a corner with no escape, they'll fight back. And when nuclear powers fight back, people die. In 1990, as the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union began its final collapse, American Secretary of State James Baker sat across from Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev and made a promise. He said, and I'm quoting directly here, "NATO will not expand 1 inch to the east." 1 inch. That was the deal. The Soviets would allow German reunification. They would withdraw from Eastern Europe. They would accept their loss. And in return, NATO would not advance into the territory that Russia had historically considered its buffer zone. Gorbachev accepted. The Soviet military withdrew. And within a decade, that promise was shattered. Poland joined NATO in 1999. Hungary and the Czech Republic followed. Then came the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, nations that were literally part of the Soviet Union. Then Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia. Every single expansion moved NATO closer to Moscow. Every single expansion tightened the noose. And every single expansion triggered warnings from Russian leaders, from moderates and hardliners alike, that there was a limit, that there was a red line, that pushing NATO into Ukraine would be seen as an existential threat. Now, I need you to understand something critical here. This isn't about whether Russia is right or wrong. This isn't about morality. This is about power. And in international politics, power has its own logic. That logic doesn't care about your values. It doesn't care about your intentions. It cares about capability and proximity and threat perception. And when a nuclear superpower tells you repeatedly for 2 decades that a specific action will trigger a military response, you have 2 choices. You can adjust your strategy, or you can prepare for war. NATO chose war. Let me give you a comparison that Americans will understand immediately. Imagine that China spent the last 20 years building a military alliance with Mexico and Canada. Imagine Chinese troops conducting exercises in Tijuana. Imagine Chinese missile systems being positioned in Vancouver. Imagine Mexico and Canada signing mutual defense treaties with Beijing, agreements that would bring Chinese forces to the Rio Grande and the Great Lakes. How would America respond? Would Americans say, well, Mexico and Canada are sovereign nations, they can join any alliance they want, we have no right to object? Of course not. America would see it as an intolerable threat. America would demand it stop, and if it didn't stop, America would act. That's not aggression. That's basic security logic. Every great power in history has operated this way. Russia has been saying this exact thing about Ukraine for 20 years, not as propaganda, not as justification for conquest, as a genuine security concern rooted in geography, history, and strategic vulnerability. Ukraine isn't just another country to Russia. It's the historic heartland of Russian civilization. It's where Kievan Rus began over 1,000 years ago. It's the buffer territory that has protected Moscow from Western invasion for centuries. Napoleon marched through Ukraine. Hitler marched through Ukraine. Both times, Russia lost tens of millions of people. So when NATO started talking about bringing Ukraine into the alliance, when Western governments began arming and training Ukrainian forces, when NATO conducted military exercises on Ukrainian soil, Russia saw exactly what America would see if the situation were reversed: encirclement, threat, the final move in a strategy designed to render them permanently weak. And here's the part that should terrify you. American policymakers knew this. They had the intelligence, they had the analysis, they had scholars, strategists, and diplomats screaming warnings. In 2008, the American ambassador to Russia sent a cable to Washington explicitly stating that Ukrainian NATO membership was the brightest of all red lines for Russia. He said, and again I'm quoting, "This is a question of vital national interest. Russia will do whatever it takes to prevent it." That cable was ignored. In 2014, after the Maidan revolution in Ukraine, after the Western-backed government took power in Kyiv, Russia annexed Crimea, not because Putin woke up one morning and decided to be aggressive, because Russia was facing the imminent loss of its Black Sea naval base in It was a desperate move by a power that saw its strategic position collapsing. Did NATO step back? Did anyone in Washington say, maybe we pushed too far, maybe we need to give Russia an off-ramp? No. The response was sanctions, more military aid to Ukraine, more NATO expansion talk, every move designed to weaken Russia, to isolate it, to force it into submission, and every move pushed Russia closer to the decision it finally made in 2022. Full-scale military intervention in Ukraine now. Let me be very clear about what I'm saying here, because people love to misinterpret analysis as endorsement. I'm not justifying Russian actions. I'm not defending the invasion. I'm explaining cause and effect. I'm explaining that when you back a nuclear power into a corner, when you leave them with no diplomatic solution, when you threaten their core security interests, they will fight. That's not opinion. That's historical pattern. And the West walked right into it. Here's the deeper structural problem. After the Soviet Union collapsed, America had a choice. It could build a global order based on great power accommodation, one that recognized Russia and China as legitimate regional powers with their own security spheres. Or it could pursue hegemony. It could try to maintain permanent American dominance over every region of the world. It chose hegemony, and that choice is now destroying the very order America built. The logic was seductive. America was the sole superpower. Its economy was twice the size of any rival. Its military could project power anywhere on Earth. Its alliances spanned the globe. Why not use this moment of total dominance to lock in permanent advantage? Why not expand NATO to Russia's borders? Why not surround China with military bases? Why not sanction any government that didn't comply with American preferences? Why not assume that the unipolar moment would last forever? Because moments don't last forever. Power is always temporary. And when you use your moment of dominance to humiliate rivals instead of accommodating them, you create exactly the kind of opposition that ends your dominance. Think about how empires actually fall. They don't usually get conquered by stronger powers. They overextend. They exhaust themselves trying to maintain control over too much territory with too few resources. They make enemies unnecessarily. They alienate potential allies. They become arrogant. They assume their strength is permanent. And then, one day, they look around and realize they're surrounded by hostile coalitions. that their economy is strained, that their population is tired of endless wars, and that the world has changed while they were busy trying to freeze it in place. That's where America is right now. The NATO expansion into Ukraine accelerated a process that was already underway. The formation of a genuine multipolar world order. Russia and China are now bound together by strategic necessity, not because they're natural allies. They have their own tensions, their own competing interests, but because they both face American containment, they both need to resist American hegemony, and they both recognize that together they're strong enough to break the unipolar system. Iran has moved closer to Russia and China. India is building relationships with all three, while keeping distance from Washington. The global South is increasingly skeptical of American leadership. Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, nations that were supposed to be integrated into the Western order, are now hedging, building alternative relationships, questioning why they should accept American dominance. The economic architecture is shifting to the dollar's role as the global reserve currency is being challenged, not destroyed overnight, but gradually eroded. Russia and China are trading in their own currencies, BRICS. Nations are developing alternative payment systems. Oil transactions that used to be denominated exclusively in dollars are now happening in yuan and rupees. This isn't happening because these countries are anti-American. It's happening because American financial sanctions taught them that relying on dollar-denominated systems makes them vulnerable to American coercion. So they're building alternatives, and every alternative that gets built weakens American leverage. This is the tragedy of the containment strategy. When it works, when you're containing a genuinely expansionist power, like Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan, it prevents catastrophe. But when you try to contain peer competitors, powers that have their own regional interests, their own historical spheres of influence, their own legitimate security concerns, containment doesn't work. It just drives them together. It creates exactly the unified opposition that makes your position weaker. America tried to contain Russia. It drove Russia into China's arms. America is trying to contain China. It's driving China to build deeper ties with Russia, Iran, and the global South. The containment strategy is producing the opposite of its intended effect, and now we're in an escalation spiral. More weapons to Ukraine, more NATO forces on Russia's borders, more sanctions on Russia's economy, each move designed to weaken Russia, each move making Russia more desperate, each move increasing the probability that this conflict expands beyond Ukraine. Because here's what American policymakers don't seem to understand. Russia cannot afford to lose in Ukraine, not because Putin's ego is at stake, because Russia's entire security architecture is at stake. If Ukraine becomes a NATO member, if NATO missiles are positioned 300 miles from Moscow, Russia becomes permanently vulnerable. It becomes a regional power that can be coerced, threatened, and ultimately broken. No Russian leader can accept that. Not Putin, not anyone. Which means Russia will escalate before it accepts defeat. An escalation between nuclear powers is how civilization ends. Let me take you back to 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev decided to place nuclear missiles in Cuba, 90 miles from Florida. President Kennedy's response was immediate and unequivocal. Those missiles had to go. There was no negotiation about Cuban sovereignty. There was no discussion about whether Cuba had the right to host Soviet weapons. Kennedy said, "Remove them or we invade." The world came closer to nuclear war than at any point in history. But Kennedy and Khrushchev both understood the stakes. They both recognized that you cannot place offensive weapons on the doorstep of a nuclear superpower. So they made a deal. Khrushchev removed the missiles from Cuba. Kennedy secretly agreed to remove American missiles from Turkey. Both sides stepped back from the abyss. Now ask yourself this. If America couldn't tolerate Soviet missiles 90 miles from Florida, why does America expect Russia to tolerate NATO forces 90 miles from Moscow? Why is Cuban sovereignty less important than Ukrainian sovereignty? Why is American security concern legitimate, but Russian security concern is dismissed as paranoia? The answer is simple. Because America is stronger. Because America believes it can impose rules on others that it doesn't follow itself. Because America has convinced itself that its hegemony is not just beneficial but inevitable. And that belief is driving us toward catastrophe. There's a principle in international relations theory called the security dilemma. It works like this. When one state increases its security, it often decreases the security of other states. You build up your military to defend yourself. Your neighbor sees your military build up and feels threatened, so they build up their military. Now you feel more threatened, so you build up more. And round it goes until minor tensions become major confrontations. The security dilemma is worst when states don't trust each other, when they can't credibly signal that their intentions are defensive, when every move looks like preparation for attack. NATO expansion is a textbook case of the security dilemma. NATO says, we're just a defensive alliance. We're not threatening Russia. We're just protecting our members. But from Russia's perspective, a defensive alliance that keeps expanding toward your borders, that conducts military exercises simulating attacks on your territory, that positions missiles closer and closer to your capital, that doesn't look defensive. It looks like preparation for war. And when that alliance is led by a superpower that has already invaded Iraq, bombed Libya, overthrown governments in Ukraine and Georgia, armed insurgents in Syria, Russia doesn't believe the peaceful intentions. Russia sees and Russia responds accordingly. The rational thing for America to have done after the Cold War was to recognize that Russia has legitimate security interests in its near abroad, not to let Russia conquer its neighbors, but to acknowledge that Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia, these are buffer states. They're not going to join NATO. They're not going to host American missiles. They can be independent. They can have their own foreign policies, but they won't be used as platforms for threatening Russia. That's called a sphere of influence, and every great power in history has had one. America has the Western Hemisphere. China expects deference in East Asia. Russia should have expected a buffer zone in Eastern Europe. Instead, America said no spheres of influence. We can put NATO wherever we want, and now we're paying the price for that arrogance. Let me tell you what comes next, because the trajectory is clear. We're entering a period of prolonged great power competition. The unipolar moment is over. The world is multipolar now. America, China, and Russia are the three major poles, with Europe, India, and regional powers playing supporting roles. This new system will be less stable than the Cold War because it's not bipolar. It's not two alliances staring at each other across a clear line. It's multiple powers with overlapping interests, competing alliances, and no clear rules. Wars will be more frequent. Economic crises will be more severe. The risk of nuclear escalation will be constant. The Ukraine conflict won't end quickly. Even if the fighting stops tomorrow, the underlying competition continues. Russia will remain opposed to NATO expansion. America will continue trying to weaken Russia. China will support Russia because Chinese leaders know they're next on the containment list. The global economy will fragment into competing blocs. Technology will decline. Supply chains will be reorganized around political alliances rather than economic efficiency. The era of globalization is ending, not because globalization failed economically, but because it became politically unsustainable in a multipolar world. American relative power will continue to decline, not because America is collapsing, but because other powers are rising. China's economy will surpass America's within a decade. India will become the third largest economy. Russia will remain a major military power despite its smaller economy. And as American relative power declines, America will face a choice: accept multipolarity and negotiate a new balance of power, or double down on hegemony and exhaust itself trying to maintain dominance it can no longer afford. If history is any guide, America will choose the second option, because declining hegemons always do. Britain tried to maintain its empire long after it could afford it. The result was decades of imperial overstretch, economic crisis, and eventual collapse. Spain, France, the Ottomans, every declining empire follows the same pattern. They refuse to accept that their moment has passed. They keep fighting to preserve advantages that are already slipping away, and they bankrupt themselves in the process. The human cost will be staggering. Hundreds of thousands have already died in Ukraine. Millions have been displaced. The economic sanctions are impoverishing ordinary Russians while enriching the oligarchs who know how to evade them. Ukrainian cities are being reduced to rubble. And for what? So NATO can expand one more country eastward, so America can maintain the illusion of unchallenged dominance for a few more years. The cost-benefit analysis is insane, but that's what happens when strategy gets replaced by hubris. Here's what keeps me up at night. Nuclear weapons. Both sides have them. Both sides have said they're willing to use them if their core interests are threatened. Russia has explicitly stated that if it faces an existential conventional defeat, it will use tactical nuclear weapons. America has doctrines that allow for nuclear use in response to large-scale conventional attacks. And as this conflict escalates, as both sides invest more, commit more, raise the stakes higher, the threshold for nuclear use gets lower, not because leaders want to end the world, but because at some point the choice becomes use nuclear weapons or accept total defeat, and no nuclear power has ever accepted total defeat without fighting back. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended peacefully because both Kennedy and Khrushchev understood they were staring into the abyss. They felt the fear. They recognized that pride and prestige weren't worth civilizational suicide, so they made the compromises necessary to step back. But today's leaders don't seem to feel that fear. They talk casually about red lines and escalation. They armed proxies and expand alliances. They impose sanctions and deploy forces, and they seem to believe that somehow, this time will be different, that they can keep pushing without triggering the response that game theory and history both predict. They're wrong. The tragedy is that none of this was necessary. Russia wasn't trying to rebuild the Soviet Empire. Putin wasn't planning to invade Europe. Russia was a declining power trying to maintain a buffer zone. That's it. That's the entire Russian demand. Don't bring NATO into Ukraine. Recognize that Russia has security interests in its neighborhood. Give us the same deference that America demands in the Western Hemisphere. If the West had accepted that simple reality, we wouldn't be here. Ukraine would still be whole. Hundreds of thousands of people would still be alive. The global economy wouldn't be nuclear weapons wouldn't be mentioned in every diplomatic exchange. But the West couldn't accept it, because accepting it meant acknowledging that American power has limits, and acknowledging limits meant accepting multipolarity, and accepting multipolarity meant abandoning the hegemonic dream. So here we are. What should rational strategy look like now? It starts with honesty, acknowledging that NATO expansion caused this crisis, acknowledging that Russia has legitimate security concerns, acknowledging that Ukraine cannot be a NATO member. Those acknowledgements don't cost anything strategically. Ukraine wasn't going to join NATO anyway. The alliance was never going to fight Russia over Ukrainian territory, but making those acknowledgements official, cementing them in agreements, giving Russia the diplomatic victory it needs to step back, that could end the war. It could create a framework for coexistence. It could prevent the escalation spiral from reaching the nuclear threshold, but that would require wisdom. It would require leaders who understand that great power politics is about managing competition, not eliminating it. Leaders who recognize that security is relative, not absolute. Leaders who know that sometimes you have to give ground diplomatically to avoid losing everything militarily. And I don't see those leaders in power right now. What I see are ideologues who believe American hegemony is a moral imperative. Strategists who think Russia can be defeated without triggering escalation. Politicians who would rather risk nuclear war than admit they were wrong. The clock is ticking, not metaphorically, literally. Every day this conflict continues. The probability of catastrophic escalation increases. Every weapons system we send to Ukraine makes Russia more desperate. Every sanction we impose pushes Russia deeper into China's arms. Every NATO exercise we conduct near Russian territory increases the chance of accident or miscalculation, and accidents between nuclear powers don't have happy endings.
If you take one thing away from this analysis, let it be this. What's happening in Ukraine is not about democracy versus authoritarianism. It's not about good versus evil. It's about power. Great power competition that's following the same patterns that have governed international politics for centuries. And those patterns are brutal. They're unforgiving. And they don't care about our values or our intentions. They care about capability and threat and survival. And right now, we're in a situation where a nuclear-armed great power feels existentially threatened. That's the most dangerous situation in international politics. And we walked into it deliberately, with eyes wide open, because we thought we were too powerful to fail. We weren't. No one ever is. And unless there's a fundamental shift in how Western leaders think about this crisis, unless someone has the courage to step back from the brink and accept that multipolarity is here whether we like it or not, we're headed toward a confrontation that will make every other mistake of the post-Cold War era look insignificant by comparison. The red line has been crossed. The question now is whether we're wise enough to uncross it before it's too late. Because in great power politics, you don't get second chances. You don't get do-overs. History moves in one direction, and right now, it's moving toward catastrophe.